So today is day 9. We're well through the course. We're just have a few more classes left for ECS 110 in spring of 2019. Today is June 5th, and we're going to check in about assignments to begin. You've hopefully been working on peer comments for reading response number 2. Thanks to those people who provoked that discussion for this round of reading responses. Next week, we have reading responses by some folks as well, reading response 3, and we have, we have some folks that are signed up for that. For next week. Give me a second. I thought I had it up. Here we are. So we already have Anissa, Angela, and Carly signed up for the day 11 reading response for next week. And then there's a 4th reading response, which the remainder of the folks who haven't done reading responses yet will be signed up for. Just wondering if anyone from reading response number 4, so Joanna, Katie, Dana, Lachlan, Kelsey, or Katie, would you be interested instead in doing the gender prompt? Would any of you like to switch? Just because we only have 3 provocations or provocateurs for day 11 for reading response 3. Any of those 6, do you feel like moving one spot before? Any takers? Joanna? Okay. If anyone else changes their mind, you just let us know. Just give us an email. That'd be good. Thank you. But that's 4 and 5 now, so that should be fine. Perfect. Thanks for that. Then also next week we have on Monday, you're writing the self-analysis is due. And then Wednesday is your Mythbusters group project. So we just wanted to check in about that and see how you're feeling there. In terms of handing in, there is a Google form that we want you to use in order to submit your writing the self-analysis. It will be posted to your blog, but we also want you to fill out this assignment submission form. It's pretty simple. It just has a little bit of a, like, we want you to provide the link and then a little bit of a note if you want to tell us anything else about your work. Okay, so make sure you have submitted the assignment submission form after you've posted to your blog. Are there questions about the analysis? Does anyone want to ask a question or talk about the analysis piece?
I was kind of confused about the second part. There was a couple of, like, just some of the questions on there. I'm just trying to pull it up here, or if you're pulling it up, perfect. Yeah, I was just there, like the first part I felt like was pretty self-explanatory, but the second part I was just feeling just confused about, I don't know, maybe just the way that the questions were being asked.
So those questions are also not meant to be like a list of things that you have to answer. They're more so there to provoke thinking, to help you to disrupt the normative narrative or to attempt to counter the normative narrative for the ways that it might be problematic. So Hillary's talking about this piece here. So number 1 asks you to Use 3 pieces, 3 stories, 3 self-stories, your own and then 2 others from your peers. And that you are looking for common sense normative myths and identifying them in the stories. And then part 2 asks you to use a 4th story perhaps. Usually it makes sense that you're using a 4th story. There are more complicated some people in the past have chosen to be more complicated and perhaps use their own story as the counter narrative. And so in that case, it's a little bit different than just choosing 4 stories or a 4th story. So in this section, what we're asking you to do is disrupt the normative narrative that you noticed in part 1, that you identified in part 1. So these kinds of questions, like how are differing stories both true in their own ways, or how can some stories silence other stories? These are questions for you to consider in order to help you think through what the problem with the normative narrative is. I definitely do not want you to go, this story differs from the other stories, da 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 da. Certain stories work to disrupt normative narratives like this. Some stories silence other stories. Like, I'm not asking you to do this kind of regurgitation assignment. Is that better? Now that you know that we're not asking you to answer them in a specific kind of way, that it's for thoughtfulness here. I made some notes in the Slack question that you posed, Hillary, just this afternoon. So others can also take a look there. So hopefully at this point, you've already sort of chosen your 3 stories, your own and then 2 others, and then attempted to weave them together. You're not summarizing. A couple of people have already posted theirs. It's not due till Monday, but you're welcome to post whenever you're ready. Notice that Joanna, we'll just use Joanna as an example here because you're first on the list. Notice that her piece has hyperlinked to the stories, her own, and then Angela's, and then Carly's, and then Lachlan's, and that's great. And then chose another story to think about disrupting whatever happened in part 1. So please also in part 2, make sure you're using course readings to help you disrupt, to help you interrupt the normative narrative. That's a main component of the assignment, and the assessment guideline outlines that as well. So if you haven't looked at the assessment guideline yet, take a peek. Again, it's not meant to have you answer questions from top to bottom, but just to give a more holistic look at what is it that you're asked to do in this assignment. So part 2, disruptions, is there's a section for use of course readings. So don't leave that out, please. And you're using it to help disrupt. So you're not just throwing in a quote because we said that you have to use a course reading or include a course reading. For hyperlinking the course readings, that's best. If it's the textbook, just cite in the textbook with the authors, and then the year, and then the page number is a citation. And then Katya says that she is fine if you hyperlink to where you can buy the book, that's fine. Or you can also include a reference of like a bibliography list at the bottom of your blog, that's fine too, whatever you prefer. Any other questions about the assignment? Tandy says, do you want the stories we choose to have similarities between each other as well? So in part 1, you're looking for similarities. Part 1 should be those 3 stories are part of a larger societal norm about whatever the topic is that you signed up for. Remember, if you signed up for the Canadian stories, then you're just looking at self-story number 1. Then for part 2, you choose a 4th story that somehow is different, or it's not telling the same kind of narrative. For part 2, you choose a 4th story, like another self story from another person. So like Joanna did again, she chose her own, writing the self too. She chose Angela's and Carly's and Lachlan's. You only need 3 here. You need your own and 2 others, but if you have a 4th, that's fine. And then for part 2, you need a 4th, someone else. So she used Minso's story. And then you also need a course reading in part 2. You need both of those things. Okay, so how's the Mythbusters going? Can you, in the chat, just let us know how Mythbusters is going for you, for your group? What are you working on lately? How are you going to finish by June 12th? Give me some details, like what does pretty good mean? What kind of tasks are left? What have you completed already? So if your group is feeling overwhelmed, or if it feels like crunch time, or if you're doing editing of the video right now, I would suggest maybe staying after we say goodnight, because technically this class goes till 9:45, so you have time, scheduled time, to check in and make sure that everyone has tasks and everyone's completing the tasks that they've agreed to. Go back to your group norms if you need to. Yeah, all of the things that you're putting in the chat is normal. So even though it's maybe feeling overwhelming at this point to get it all together, it will happen. Just keep persevering through that. Well done. Make sure you go back to those group norms. Like if you're feeling like someone has agreed to do something, but they haven't done it in the time that they said that they're going to do it in, how were you going to address that conflict? What will you do? Are there any questions about the Mythbusters assignment? Okay, we're really looking forward to those. So we're going to transition now into thinking about gender in a focused way. So we'll move from, our assignment check-in to some of the content for the day. So taking up some of the readings that you did from last class and onward. I'm going to put you into breakout groups in a second, and I want you to pay attention to the clothes that you're wearing today. You're going to discuss how you're dressed, basically, and whether you think that it's some sort of proper performance of a particular gender or not. I'm not asking you to perform a gender in a particular way. I just want you to discuss how your performance of gender plays out. And let's use what you're wearing today as an example. Or any other accessories, or even like the way that your hair is, or whatever you want to talk about. So how does the way that you present yourself, how do you express your gender? And use today as an example. that clear? Okay, so in your breakout groups, just a quick one, like maybe make sure everyone speaks and everyone gives an example of something that they're wearing in relation to expressing gender. So maybe just around like 4 or 5 minutes or less. Make sure you've chosen someone to share on behalf of your group when you come back. Okay, so who would like to speak on behalf of breakout room 1? Jean-Luc, Jesse, Kim, or Tandy?
Okay, so my group, we were just kind of saying, like how like casual wear for like the female in my group and me, like it's kind of like tighter, even though we're dressed like comfy to us and like casual, like our tank tops fit differently. Or she was saying how when she wears like a loose t-shirt, it still has like a slit, or like we have like open back or something. And the guys kind of more have like loose fitted clothing. So then shorts with that are like sports brands or beer brands and stuff like that.
Great, thanks, Tandy. For room 2, Anissa, Dana, Joanna, Angela?
So all 4 of us, we were pretty gender neutral with what we were wearing, aside from a little bit of makeup. And we kind of talked about how some of us didn't do a lot today, so that would be the reason for why we're pretty neutral, whereas sometimes if we're out working at school, we feel more inclined to dress up a little bit more in our gender.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. I see you're wearing a V-neck black t-shirt with a red tank underneath, maybe. Do you think that a guy would wear what you're wearing, even though you're like sort of dressed down?
Oh, totally. And I'm wearing it because of the Raptors game tonight, so that adds even a little bit more masculinity to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're like, yep, a guy would wear what I'm wearing. Can you stand up a little bit for us?
Nothing special. It's just
All right. Yeah, got it. So it goes along with what Tandy was saying, like the cut is different, maybe.
right.
All right. So room 3, Jillian, Carly, Katie, and Hillary.
Okay, well, we didn't really say who was talking, so I'll just talk for our group. But we kind of all discussed how we weren't really wearing anything super like feminine right now, or like more of like that. We were all girls, so it was like talking about how we were dressing. Like I'm wearing a men's sweater right now, and like we're all kind of wearing more gender neutral stuff. But that's just because we're comfortable at home, really. And when like saying how in our closets we do have a lot more of like those typically girlier things, like lower cut tops, shorter shorts, like stuff like that. And so most of our clothes were kind of like that gendered stuff.
It's interesting that you even use the phrase, I'm wearing a men's top, a men's sweater. Like, how do we know it's a men's sweater if it's a gender neutral sweater? Those kinds of language pieces are really interesting. That's all we're bringing up right now is like the way that we think about our clothes as an expression of gender. Thanks, Carly. How about room 4, Chandria, Kelsey, or Sona, or Katie?
We were talking, it was kind of 50-50. There was 2 of them in sweatpants and a big t-shirt, and then there was 2 of us in women's clothes. And then we kind of got into talking about how it's okay and normal for a girl to wear sweatpants and a baggy t-shirt, but if a guy was to wear Lululemons and a crop top, it's weird. You know, it's different. And then we got into how it's okay for girls to, you know, when they're young, even to want to play with trucks and to be into sports and to be into, you know, the things that guys are supposed to be into. But if that was vice versa, then it's, you know, that's not the norm. Yeah, it wasn't just about clothes.
Yeah, that's good. And so sometimes we make assumptions about those kinds of people, the people who don't fit into the societal norms. So they've been whatever, expressing boy, but they want to play with dolls. Or it's a guy that's wearing a crop top, like you said, and some tighter Lululemon pants. So what assumptions are made about those people based on that gender expression? Doesn't have to be just Katie here. You can put it in the chat if you like, whatever is best. So Katie said like weird, like we might think, or society might think those people are weird. What do we actually mean there? Tandy?
Yeah, like I was gonna say, like when you see like a girl who's always in like sweats or sweater, like people might assume like, oh, that girl is like chill, like low maintenance, or like very easygoing. And then when you see a guy dressed like flamboyantly or feminine, or whatever you see, you're like, oh, like is he gay?
Yeah, very good. So immediately the assumption goes to sexuality, like that gender expression must have something to do with their sexuality. And sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. So what is it called when we have those thoughts? When there's some sort of like trying to make sense of what's going on here? What is the word for that? Starts with a P. It's not discrimination, but sometimes it gets used as a synonym for discrimination. Yeah, good job, Anissa. It's prejudice. So those thoughts are thoughts that are prejudice, or sometimes people say that that's our bias. And I think it's important for us to distinguish between the thoughts that we have and the actions that we take based on the thoughts. the thoughts are the thing that we can say, oh, I'm thinking those thoughts. Why am I thinking those thoughts? Where is that coming from? The thoughts don't necessarily make you someone who is unethical or harmful to others. Katie, you wanted to speak as well?
But as Tandy was saying, even if like there is a girl in sweats and a baggy hoodie or something, things, oh, you know, she just got off work, or, you know, she's, like she said, low maintenance or whatever. And then sometimes if a guy is wearing that kind of stuff, it's like he's lazy and he doesn't work, and that kind of assumptions.
Yeah, all of these things are prejudice. So that can also intersect, like if you're talking about, oh, he doesn't work, oh, he's lazy, that intersects with prejudice around class as well, like you were talking about last day with Katya. So very good here. I think we have one more group maybe to share. Kyle, Lachlan, Louisa.
Yeah, so we talked about like what clothing we were wearing, and we found that we were all kind of wearing like gendered clothing. Like Louisa mentioned that she was wearing like a pink top, and like pink is very like it's kind of thought of as like a girl color. Like guys that wear not so much anymore, but like guys like wearing pink is like not really as popular for guys. Then mentioned like shorts and like t-shirts for guys is like very common, especially in like the hot weather. And I said like I was working today and I have to wear like long black pants and like a collared shirt to go to work, and like that's what like every other guy is wearing. Like the colors change a lot, but it's like pretty much just the same thing.
Thanks, Kyle. We have all of these norms that we're supposed to follow, like dress codes are norms. They're understandings of how we're supposed to act or behave or express ourselves based on how we feel and how we identify in terms of gender. So we want to start to pick this apart a little bit tonight. We want to ask questions around how gender is constructed, how we come to know ourselves as gendered. This is part of what your self-story 4 was meant to sort of tease you towards thinking about that. And those of you who are doing the analysis for the self-story 4, pay particular attention to the disruption of gender, or thinking about gender as a construction. I'm going to share my screen again, and I'll just give you a couple of notes about the topics or the terms that we're going to be talking about in the next couple classes. So we'll ask this question: what is gender? Where does it come from? How does it operate? And then also we want to think about the gender binary as a normative narrative or a myth. The gender binary relates to a particular kind of normativity or like thinking about what's normal, called heteronormativity. So that's where we were talking about like making assumptions, having a prejudice around, okay, I perceive you to be a girl, which means that you must be straight and attracted to men. That's heteronormativity. Am I still frozen? It's good now? Okay, I'm going to repeat what I just said then. Thanks for telling me in the chat. So we'll ask the question, what is gender? And we will think about gender as a construction, but specifically we want to disrupt the idea of the gender binary, or think about the binary as a myth. Can you still not hear me? You can hear fine? Okay. So we want to call the gender binary myth a normative narrative, and that normative narrative, the gender binary, is related to heteronormativity, which is an assumption that we are attracted to the opposite sex. So it's a straight normativity here. Like we were saying before, that if we perceive someone to be a girl, that we then assume that they are attracted to boys or attracted to men. We're also going to briefly touch on the idea of sexism in relation to gender, and think about the ways that gender and sexuality and gender and sexual diversity are intersecting or interlocking. Throughout, we want to think about undoing gender. So this is a disruption or a countering of the gender construction. I'm going to make my screen large here. Hopefully the internet continues to cooperate. And I want to ask you a question about these photos. These photos next. So either in the chat, excuse me, either in the chat or you can raise your hand, but definitely use the chat. This is one of my relatives, my sister's kid. I would like you to, you're already doing it, well done. You're perceiving them to be either a boy or a girl. And some of you maybe aren't sure. You're using certain pronouns. I want you to start doing what Chandria just did and say why. So Chandria said that they're wearing dinosaurs. I think it's spaceships actually, but you know, either way, it's fine. So I want you to look for those cues. So there's the long hair that's been listed. Anything else? The long hair and the pajamas. Okay, the hair isn't nicely combed. The dark blue top, some of the facial features maybe even. So there were, I think, maybe 2.5 in this picture. What do you think that a lot of the adults in this person's life were telling them? What do you think was going on in this person's life from their adults? Yeah, Kim says if it's a boy, if they are being assigned as a boy, that the adults in their life are saying, you should cut your hair. And then if it's a girl, they're saying, you're not wearing girl clothes. That's pretty much what happened. So Bristol identifies as a boy. He is 6 now, and he has short hair now. Also, his older brother told him to cut his hair, but it happened when the older brother started going to school. So as soon as the older brother was in school, came home and realized that his younger brother needed to have his hair cut because he wasn't acting like a proper boy. And so that was the feedback that Bristol was getting. Bristol had his hair long because my sister and her husband like punk rock music. So that's why they had their hair long. It wasn't even really their choice. It's not like he wanted his hair long. It's just what his parents did. So I want you to think about the people in your own life and some of the interactions you've maybe had or seen people have. Sometimes this is called gender policing, like when we try to do something that's not in the gender norm. The feedback that we get from others, even though it might be delivered in a sweet way, it teaches that person, that little person, that they need to act or be or express themselves only within rigid terms. Okay, look at this next picture. Maybe. There we go. This was at a birthday party. So Bristol's on the left in the purple shirt next to some of their cousins. The kid in the center with like the lumberjack shirt, that's the kid who went to school. His brother Briggs went to school and said, you got to cut your hair, you know, you better be a boy. 'Cause look at all these other boys sitting next to him. They all have their hair cut. So it's a birthday party. It's a Mario birthday party. In the treat bags, they all got mustaches. On the right is my niece. Her name's Kiara. She's 11 now, so this is quite a few years ago. And she also had a mustache in her treat bag, but she refused to wear it. I tried to say, put it on. It's so much fun. You can do it. My other sisters said the same thing to her. We put on the mustaches to show her that it was okay, that it's just for fun. What's going on there with her, do you think? What's going on in her mind? Even the way she's standing. I've shown them these pictures as well as older kids now. They know that I talk to you about them in class. Yeah, she's trying to fit into her gender role. She knows she needs to act feminine. She knows her gender traits. She's wearing a pink shirt. She has earrings on. She's doing all the things. She's even standing in like a proper girl way, right? So gender gets constructed from a very, very young age. Even in moments when you want kids to try and counter that gender binary or go against the norm or be a little bit provocative, sometimes they won't do it because they've already learned. They've already been taught either in school or from other kinds of feedback that she might get made fun of. Yeah, you've got it all here. We know all of these things because they've probably happened to us. Maybe not in the exact same way. When I was young, I was oldest of my family. I've never told this story before, but I think it's appropriate. So I was the oldest of 4. And when I was getting older, I was like maybe 12 and not shaving my legs yet. My younger brother and 2 younger sisters made fun of me for having hairy legs. So I pressured my mom to let me shave my legs. It even happens in those like small ways from people that are younger than you who have already learned what the gender roles are. So these things get taught in really complex and nuanced and tiny ways. It's not like we get sat down and taught how to be a girl or how to be a boy. It just sort of happens over time with the feedback that we get, with the reactions that we get, with our interactions as well. So this story, I think, helps us to ask the question, what is gender? Gender basically is just a story. It's a story that we tell about who we think we are in relation to others. It helps us to make sense of ourselves as gender beings. And when I say that it's a story, I don't mean that it's not true. I don't mean that gender is a myth, or that it is false, or that it is not a thing, but that we societally think about 2 genders as making sense. So in the symbols up on the right, we think about the blue symbol and the pink symbol as making sense, and the rainbow symbol probably is not making sense from a normative standpoint. So this is partly why we wanted you to think about your own self stories, to think through how gender gets constructed in society. Let's also think about our the terms that relate to anatomy. So sex is the term that relates to our biological form, our body. We have primary characteristics and secondary characteristics that have to do with our sex. Sex doesn't just equal gender. So gender expression, they're always embodied experiences, but it doesn't necessarily equate to what the sex of the body is. Sex doesn't equal gender. It's not so simple. Sometimes they are connected in easy ways, or what society thinks is an easy way, but it's not as simple to say oh, I have these parts, that means I'm a girl. Gender is storied, it's socially constructed, and it has a lot of different kinds of meanings that we tell about who we are and how we perceive others. So we say that gender is a construction. Oh, here I'll also just note that the terms for our body are different than the terms for our gender. Sometimes we use these interchangeably, but I want us in this course to start practicing distinction. So the terms for sex are male and female or intersex, and there might be others, but those are the most common terms for sex. For the anatomy, male, female, or anatomy terms. With gender, the corresponding terms for gender are woman or girl, and man or boy. Those are the easy ones. So whenever we say female or male in this course, we're referring to anatomy. Woman and man, or girl and boy, that's gender. So we just have different terms to refer to that construction. So girl or boy. On the right-hand side is a small little photo. It looks like a video, but it's just a clip. Like I just took a screenshot of a Facebook video. This is my partner's sister and her husband. And his family, his sisters created this gender reveal activity. They had a dozen eggs, and some of them were painted blue and some of them were painted pink, and they cracked the eggs on each other's head. And when one of them got a raw egg, that meant that was the gender of the baby. So they went through this whole dozen egg, cracking eggs on each other's head. All of them were hard-boiled except one. And the one that was raw was blue. So they said, oh, you're having a boy. How exciting, you're having a boy. And so now she's due, I think, in August. And so now we all say, oh, Brenda's having a boy. Brenda and Adam are having a boy. It's so awesome. What are we actually doing here when we start early with gender construction? Like, what are we actually wanting to know about this baby? Kim says that they're having a male. Exactly. So we're only actually knowing about their anatomy, their biology, their body right now. It's almost like we're just asking, do they have a penis or a vagina? That's basically what we're doing at gender reveal parties. And so, yeah, Kyle says people want to know what to expect and how they'll treat the baby, but it's not so easy as that. We assume it's that easy, but it's not necessarily that easy. Someone I know told me recently that they raised 2 boys, and one of their children is transitioning. And so, like, thinking about raising 2 boys and that kind of idea of I'm going to raise a boy, so Brenda and Adam thinking they're going to raise a boy, do we need to put that gender on that kid necessarily, or can we do that in more nuanced ways? Yeah, we have this assumption that if that body has a penis, then it will be a boy, then they'll identify as a boy. So we come to know ourselves as gendered through a process of coming to understand ourselves in these categories, and sometimes the categories that are assigned to us, the gender categories that are assigned to us at birth, aren't the ones that we identify with. One of my dad's cousins transitioned when they were in their 40s because they were assigned boy at birth, but their whole life knew they were a girl. And finally, in their 40s, felt like they had to tell the truth. And that person, their name is Laura Budd, and I believe that I'm asking you to read her story this week. Yes, it's this one here. How small is too small of a community to transition in? So she transitioned in a small little, the town's name is Kelleher, the same town with the Confederate flag, 300 people, right? So small Saskatchewan town. Imagine transitioning in a small Saskatchewan town and what that would have been like. So gender reveal parties, do we need to do that? This is a bit of a joke, but also, you know, what might this be like? If I get pregnant and throw a gender reveal party, cut open the cake and reveal a landslide of green M&Ms or yellow M&Ms. What does green mean? What does yellow mean? In our confusion, you know, maybe we can bar the doors and have a captive audience for a bit of Gender 101. I mean, I'm not suggesting that you're actually going to do that, but it's kind of funny to think about. How do we talk in our everyday moments at our baby showers, at our birthday parties about gender? It's probably, you know, not going to be a presentation, but how do we disrupt the idea that we can only be boys or only be girls? And if we have male parts, we have to be boys, and if we have female parts, then we have to be girls. This is what we want to start to pull apart a little bit. So gender is a construction. This doesn't mean that gender isn't real or that biology plays no part in this construction. What it does mean is that gender is located within discourses, or it's located within stories, societal stories that construct masculinity and femininity in certain ways, and often these ways are unequal. The hope here is that it's not necessary for us to continue to reproduce the gender binary as a normative narrative. If gender is just a construction, then we can also unmake that construction by questioning, by undoing that gender binary. So here's Gender 101 for you. The gender binary, sort of a really simple definition, is that it's one or the other. We have two distinct opposite sexes. That's the myth. That's the normative narrative that needs to be problematized. So it's basically like we have this. We have an idea that male means boy or man, and that boy or man means you have to be masculine. And masculine means you have to be strong. And strong means you have to be rational, not emotional. And that you're full of culture and the mind, that you're logical, that your bodies are active, that you work, and that you're dominant in society. Whereas the gender binary would suggest that females have to be identifying as girls or women, and that women have to be feminine, and that women are weaker than men, and that often they're emotional or irrational. Maybe they're more having to do with nature as opposed to culture, and often here the myth is that women, because women give birth, they're more attuned to nature, that they're more having to do with the body rather than the mind. They're not thinkers, they're feelers. This is the normative narrative, the gender binary, that they're passive instead of active, that we're submissive, that we're mothers, not workers. And so you see how this construction with the line in the center is like one or the other. You're this or you're that. There's no nuance. This is the thing we want to disrupt. We know that this isn't the case in society, in the world, with individuals. And so why do we have to tell the story that we're one or the other? So trans is an umbrella term applied to those whose gender identity is not the same as the sex they were assigned at birth. Cisgender is just a way to say that you identify as you were assigned at birth based on your sex. So it's someone who's not transgender, basically. So I identify as a woman, and if I want to be more specific, I could say I identify as a cis woman because my parents and the doctors when I was born looked at my anatomy and said, you're a girl. So I was assigned girl, I was assigned female. And so that's how I might be more specific and say I'm a cis woman. I've not had to transition. Gender queer, you might have heard of also like gender neutral or gender fluid, is a term that individuals would choose to use who don't identify within the gender binary. Transitioning is the process of changing one's gender expression to match their gender identity. Notice that this is not about sex changes. Transitioning is not necessarily about changing anatomy. Sometimes there are surgeries that go along with transitioning, but not always. So in order to disrupt the gender binary, we need to disrupt the assumption that anatomy equals gender. So a review of these things. The gender binary is socially constructed. It's pretty strict, and it's an either or. It's male, female means boy or girl. The dominant subject position in this construction is that the male, the man, has structural privilege, which results in a kind of hypermasculinity and sexism that is sometimes referred to as hypermasculinity. Like men need to present themselves as strong, rational, the kind of man that would support a woman, like those kinds of stories is hypermasculine stories, or like someone who's tough, someone who can take care of a woman, someone who can protect a woman, that's hypermasculine. Someone who doesn't cry, all of those things are hypermasculinity. The gender binary seeks conformity. It wants us to be one or the other, this story. So we're regulated, and we also regulate ourselves, our bodies, and other people's bodies with various social cues like dress codes or phrases like sit like a lady, or things like don't cry if you're a boy. Sometimes this is referred to as the gender police, as I've referred to before. So I want to ask some questions now that we have an understanding around gender as a construction and the gender binary as a myth or a normative narrative that's problematic. I want to ask you some questions about sexism. So if I asked all the women, what would you do if all men had a 9 p.m. curfew? Is that question sexist? Here's a song. We're going to ask, is this song sexist? So I'm going to maybe post it in the chat and give you a minute to look at it. And I want you, more than a yes or no, I want you to think about why or why not could this be considered sexist, these things? What is sexism is the question here. What would you do if all men had a 9 p.m. curfew? Is this sexist? And I'm going to give you the link to this video just because I was paused before, otherwise I would play it, but I think it's probably best if you listen to part of it on your own. And then we'll have a little discussion. So it's in the weekly plans under number 2. I'll also put it in the chat. Can you give me a thumbs up if you've had time to watch part of the video, just to get a sense of it? Like in your participant section, just give a thumbs up. Okay, so there's a couple of things in the chat. This question, what would you do if all men had a 9 p.m. curfew, comes from this article where women responded. It was a Twitter post, and specifically it's related to sexual assault and thinking about how women are told how to be safe. So let's think about the idea of sexism. I'm just taking a peek at your chat comments. Okay, so the song was written in response to during the time when Brett Kavanaugh was being accused of sexual assault and was being considered for the Supreme Court seat in the United States, and now sits on the Supreme Court. But so the girl who wrote this song was also sort of given a lot of feedback about how her song was inappropriate. So the reasons I want to ask questions like, is this question sexist, or is she a feminist, or why not? What does it mean to be a feminist in the context of sexism in our society? Is International Women's Day sexist? That happened in March. It always happens in March. And so there's a common rebuttal that people will say, well, there's no International Men's Day. And in fact, there is an International Men's Day. But remember, we talked about the Black Lives Matter movement and then the common rebuttal, but all lives matter. This is a similar kind of common rebuttal. So is International Women's Day sexist? This is a common rebuttal as well. Is that sexist? So we want to really understand what it means to be sexist. The IST parts, so sexism or classism or racism, these isms are all about systems and structure. So when an individual does something, if she is a woman, she cannot be sexist. This is like saying a white person can be racist, but a person of color can't be racist. Why is that? Do you remember? Why is that? Why can white people act in racist ways, but people of color can never be racist? Yes, it has to do with being a part of the dominant or the group that has the social power, or that white people historically have not been oppressed in the Western world, or globally for that matter. But if we're talking about the Western world, for sure. So when we talk about isms like racism, that's a societal, social structure. Same thing with sexism. So we often talk about sexism as being like individual acts of assault, but it's not. So we want to understand sexism and racism as attached to power. And someone put that in the chat. So it was sort of up above. So thank you for that. The piece where you said that it's having to do with institutions and adding power. So we don't call it reverse sexism, just like we wouldn't call it reverse racism. Instead, we can talk about gender discrimination. So for if in a certain case, a man is being gender policed by women or being called like a male pig or something like that, that's gender discrimination. That's not sexism. So I'm not saying that women can't say hateful things to men, that is not the case. That is possible. Women can do and say things to men that perhaps are based on their gender, but it's not, we can't call it sexism, because the definition of sexism is that there's gender discrimination plus some institutionalized or structural privilege of power. So this is a systematic oppression of women by a group of men as the patriarchy. It's not just like individual men. It's based on this underlying assumption, the value or the belief that men are somehow superior to women, and it perpetuates the unequal distribution of wealth, of resources, and of power. So asking women this question, what would you do if all men had a 9 p.m. curfew, is not sexist. That is not a sexist question. That is asking about the way that our interactions happen in the world from a structural perspective. Men might think that it's discriminatory based on gender, but it's not sexist. So we want to also think about feminism a little bit in terms of sexism and gender-based discrimination. We'll get there in a minute. Let's do this little activity quickly. I want you to think about what steps you take on a daily basis to prevent yourself from being sexually assaulted. So there's a chart here that I would like us just to stick some ideas in really quickly. And I'm going to give that to you in the chat. And then just go in real quick and throw in some ideas. What steps do you take on a daily basis to prevent yourselves from being sexually assaulted? Okay, that's good. We can stop. It doesn't really matter if your comments were mixed in with others. What I want you to notice here is that the women's column happened a lot quicker than the men's. And in the men's, there are a couple that are like no preventative steps or nothing. And I don't think that there's very many of those in the women's upon first glance. Okay, so women have also been taught that they need to fear men. And someone in the chat said, well, females can rape men as well. We're not saying that they can't. What we're saying is that men who, even if we don't go to the extreme of rape, if we're just talking about sexual harassment, or like thinking about workplace dynamics, when men engage in those kinds of interactions with women, there's an assumption that they're allowed to do that or that there won't be consequences. And maybe this is changing a little bit, but consider women how many times you maybe have just tried to shrug something off or laugh it away or pretend that it was no big deal. And I think that this column indicates that that doesn't happen as often to men. And there are also, you know, a lot of testimonies that are to give more evidence of these things. Remember, we're not looking for anecdotes, we're looking for patterns. So yes, men are, you know, going to pay attention to the personal space of strangers and keeping an eye on who's around. And women sometimes make sexual advances towards men in inappropriate ways. But what we're saying here is that when women do those things, it's not with the same sense of structural power. So, you know, who's going to believe a man if they say that they were raped by a woman? That's what I mean by structural power here. So, the ways that we perceive how men and women interact are important and help us to understand the institutions that we operate in. So in the workplace is the easiest one to think about, or in schools, how little comments or whatnot get brushed aside by women in predominant ways. So again, this is just to illustrate the ways in which women have been taught to be a particular kind of careful around men or late at night or whatever, or in the workplace or at school. And men have a different story going on. And so partly this is how gender and sexuality intersect. So this is a common activity. This is not an activity that I made up. Jackson Katz talks about it in the macho paradox. And it's to attempt to help men understand some of the interactions that women have experienced. We might also ask what's missing in such columns, right? So it sort of oversimplifies it. It assumes that men don't experience any kind of assault, or it also doesn't consider how women of color are more susceptible to sexual assault than white women. Sometimes when we talk about sexism, it also reproduces this gender binary. So the idea that just men are assaulting women is too simplistic. There's a lot of trans oppression from both men and women, from cis men and cis women, that needs to be taken up. So feminism can help us to ask questions like, what's missing here? This is just a little tiny history note that there are different kinds of understandings of what feminism is. Some people will interpret feminism as having to do with voting rights for women, but remember that women of color didn't get to vote at the same time as white women. Sometimes people will understand feminism as having to do with like radical stances that came out of the 60s and 70s, like women's rights, or stereotypes around like not shaving your armpits or bra burning and other kinds of civil rights movements. But that is also a very narrow understanding of feminism. And again, they refer to them as waves, but they're not so distinct. Feminists have been working to undo the gender binary for a long time. So the third wave specifically is interested in disrupting the gender binary and reimagining what could be considered natural or normal. This is often thought to be an academic endeavor, but more and more it's becoming a mainstream feminist movement. The fourth wave also says that men can be feminists too, that feminism is not just for men, and that it's a way that we can identify as a feminist. So instead of considering feminism as just this exclusionary kind of group of people who are only doing one specific thing, and that is hating men, it can be opened up into a disruption of sexism, which is a disruption of patriarchy as the power dynamic of gender. It can also be thought of as a disruption of hypermasculinity. So it's about not requiring boys to be a particular kind of boy. It's not just all about girls all the time. It's about problematizing the idea of being tough or like manning up. So what does it actually mean to man up? Term is often used in reference to hypermasculinity. But the Man Up Against Violence campaign by Jackson Katz attempts to flip that around and work on more complicated notions of what it means to be a boy or what it means to be a girl. We also have witnessed movements like Me Too, and we might think about how movements like Me Too contribute to dismantling patriarchy and dismantling sexism. You have one reading this upcoming week about the Me Too movement in Canada, and I just wanted you to understand that this movement began by a Black woman in the US who was working with young Black women and girls from low wealth communities. And so this isn't just a movement for celebrities or moviegoers or white women. This has its roots in it's a grassroots movement by a person of color, and so white people need to sure be part of that movement, but remember not to co-opt it or attempt to ethically be part of it. I'm gonna have you watch this before Monday, which is a kind of like a Mythbusters that a group of students from Saskatoon did a few years back. There's a CBC article about it, and there's some explicit pieces in it. Basically what they did is they took advertisements in magazines that were highly sexualized and oppressive of women and flipped them to show that it would be ridiculous if men were represented in those same roles. So make sure you take a peek at that. I also just wanted to draw your attention to Pride this week, which starts on the 7th, so starts on Friday. It's a Pride festival for the week, and the parade is on the 15th. And we asked you to read a piece about things you should know as I think the article said as straight allies before you go to a pride parade or a pride event. Here's a crosswalk being painted at 13th Avenue and Scarth in Regina. There's a trans flag at 13th Avenue and Lawrence Street, or at least it was there on June 2nd. So I think this Saturday there's also the Pride Festival at the Farmers Market if you're interested in checking that out. We'll talk more about Pride on Monday. Are there any questions that you have about Pride right now, or feminism, or sexism, or the gender binary? It's kind of like an introductory sort of like a quick entry point into gender and sexual diversity. So Kim has a question in the chat. Are transgender men more likely to experience sexual assault than cis men? It depends on what kind of a sexual assault. Like, I don't know if we can say like one way or the other necessarily. Often transgender people in general experience different forms of assault more often than cis people in general. Are there any other questions or things that you'd like to note for today? Maybe to close, in the chat, can you write one thing that you learned or one thing that was confirmed for you about Pride, about the Pride Festival in Regina, or about your experience with Pride, whatever you'd like to share? That's how we'll close. Yeah, Pride started from a riot. Or we could say like riot sometimes criminalizes. That word riot seems like a criminal endeavor. So we might say like a particular kind of protest or a particular kind of resistance. What else did you learn, or what else was confirmed for you? Yeah, it's not a day for straight people. It's not about stealing the thunder. I'm gonna wear a Love is Love shirt on Saturday, but I'm not going to go, you know, necessarily posting photos and making myself the center of attention. Any other thoughts? So if you haven't, make sure you've taken a peek at this reading about coming to Pride. So number 3 says, don't take pictures or snaps of us without permission. It's not for the straight gaze. Even though it seems so extravagant and full of beauty, it's not there for straight people's entertainment. Okay, thanks for the evening. Make sure you do the tasks, the before next class tasks. There's some readings, there's a couple of activities. The Bechtel test is a test that asks about if there's sexism in movies. And it's also very simple and can be problematized. So we want you to put an example in a list of a movie and then ask if it passes or not. And then also we want you to think about gender in Disney. How does the gender binary show up in Disney movies? And if you want to go beyond Disney, sure, but in Disney it's very apparent. If the movie only has one character, ask if the movie, how the movie represents gender through that character. Okay, I'm gonna stop the video and I will see you all on Monday. If you have any questions, please feel free to stay.